Hi, good evening. I'd like to say something as concisely as I can without too many digressions about today's Supreme Court verdict. Nicola Sturgeon, faced with the systematic and repeated denial of Scotland's right to hold a second independence referendum by democratic mandate of the Holyrood government and the Holyrood Parliament, led to a submission to the Supreme Court to clarify the matter. And it was inevitable from the beginning that the clarification would hinge around the nature of the Scotland Act and the fact of what were reserved powers and what weren't. The Supreme Court has come back today and clean-cut and decisively said the Holyrood Parliament, Scotland, does not have the right to call a referendum without the authorisation of the United Kingdom government of the day, namely by Westminster. The Supreme Court is not denying Scotland a referendum. It's specifying how it may have a referendum. And it's saying, and there's no other way to slice this, the only way to have it is with the consent of the British Parliament. In other words, the entity that we're trying to get out of, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, is saying that you need our consent under our law, the Scotland Act, to even seek the will of your people. Now, bear in mind, the referendum in itself, and indeed this was the basis of the submission, does not create independence if there was a yes vote. It simply states this was the view of the Scottish eligible electorate in a democratic referendum. It would, of course, provide a very powerful tool to the Scottish Government to then, if you like, seek independence directly and negotiate on the basis of that. That was the basis in advance, of course, of the 2014 referendum, which is unfortunately being referred to as the gold standard. Yes, it would have been nice and clean cut if it could have been done that way, but it will never be done that way again if the British government persists in its present opposition. So don't look on the Supreme Court as the opposition. They're interpreting the law. This stems directly from the British government as a political decision. The British government could simply say, well, we've heard what the Supreme Court has to say, and now we're going to grant a referendum to Scotland. There's nothing whatsoever to stop them doing that except the nature of unionism. It would seem a very obvious conclusion, and it's one that's been reached by very, very many Scots and by nationalities outside of Scotland, that if you enter into a union which is regularly lauded as a voluntary union of nations, a family of nations, the nations being England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, that somehow there's some kind of equality or democratic equality in there. There isn't. One partner to that union or one member of that family massively outweighs the others in terms of voting strength. And to say, having entered into that union voluntarily, you may not get out of it without the permission of the dominant partner, because that's what it is. Electorally dominant England dominates the Westminster Parliament in most situations. And an elected Westminster government can make law, interpret law, do what it likes about the law. So we're not being blocked by the Supreme Court. The judges were doing their job in the face of the Scotland Act and what the legislation is. We're being blocked by unionism, currently in the form of a Tory government, but enthusiastically supported by the Labour Party, by the Liberal Party, not by the Scottish National Party and by the Tories. And that includes the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, and the Tories in Scotland. Scots, resident Scots, or have made Scotland their adopted country, who are denying the country they live and work in and choose to spend their time in the right simply to take the view of its people. It's unacceptable. It would be unacceptable to anybody with an ounce of democratic sense in them. Just as I was about to come on and do this, I came across an article which is today in the Scotsman by Curran Martin at Supreme Court, why a de facto referendum is irrelevant and politicians must decide on the full indyref2 route. It was an interesting article, it's an important article. The headline would suggest a sort of negative approach. It's far from that. It's as all Curran Martin's articles are, an insightful and important one. And I'll be quoting from it later, not in this video, but online. Courtesy of Elon Musk, if Twitter is still available at that point in time. Now, firstly, can I thank the Supreme Court, because they have acted as a kind of catalyst for the independence movement. All the news channels tonight have been dominated by this issue, and there have been delightful pictures of independence-minded Scots gathering all over our beautiful country of Scotland, albeit on this late autumn, early winter day, demonstrating in favour of it. Even the BBC has done its bit on this, and I know the inveterate BBC critics will pick holes. If they want to pick a hole, I'll give them one to pick. In selecting a vox pop of views from people, apparently picked up at random from the street, it somehow and unerringly managed to select what it referred to as the head of a Scottish care home, which is true, one Robert Kilgour. If you stumbled across Robert Kilgour in the street, Robert Kilgour is a long-term, vigorous opponent of independence and a regular letters contributor to the Herald. He's what nationalists are fond of calling one of the usual suspects, and perhaps unionists are fond of calling me one of the unionist suspects. And as you can see by the Casablanca poster behind me, I'm a great favourite of that wonderful film of, what is it now, 80 years ago, Casablanca, thereabouts. And it was very much about independence at that time. But let's not get into the Second World War. So be clear about what's happening. Now, Nicola's speech and Ian Blackford's speeches, I had said some forceful words on Twitter in advance saying they had to say something definitive and powerful. Whereas I wouldn't say they said something as definitive and powerful as I would have liked. Ian Blackford was very good in the Commons today, and the Commons Speaker was very good in permitting a succession of Scottish SNP MPs to have their say on it, and they were consistent in their theme. How can this be called a voluntary union when any legal means of exiting from it is denied? It's like entering into a business partnership and then being told you can't get out without the permission of the dominant partner. You're condemned to remain in this partnership regardless of your economic and other interests. It's patently self-serving nonsense. It's a big country, a dominant country, and an unbalanced conglomerate of states exerting its dominance through law, through parliamentary procedures, through its media shills, and it will continue to be so. So Nicola's response to this has been, and she, in fairness to her, she's been clear for some time about the likelihood, or certainly the possibility, that there would this be legal rejection. Committed as a lawyer should be, but perhaps as an independence leader should not be, to anything that declares itself a legal route without looking closely at the source of that law and the way that law is being manipulated for party political purposes, as all laws to some degree are. She said, if this fails, then at least we've cleared that out of the way, And we are left then, as she sees it, with the only legal route to a legal referendum to treat the next general election, next UK general election, as a proxy de facto referendum. Now, I have to say she entered into this route, or her advisors who badly advised her on it, entered into it without sufficient thought of the implications of this and just what it would lead to. But if it means anything, it means that if Nicola, as she said she would, stands the SNP and the Green Alliance shoulder to shoulder on that this is a referendum on a single issue about Scotland's independence, then the major question that follows inexorably from that is if that results in a de facto yes. It has no legal force whatsoever with the UK. You can't convert the British electoral system into a referendum. And that's been a criticism offered by unions. That's a perfectly valid one. But you can say, if you deny us the normal democratic route of an agreed referendum and lock us in, we're left with no other choice. If the will of the Scottish people is at that election, in other words, if they elect another SNP Green government in sufficient numbers, then we have to say, and Nicola is not yet prepared to say this, that the Scotland Act and the UK law is irrelevant. We have the will of the Scottish people, deny us a legal route, and we have only a very limited number of choices from there on in, and they're very radical choices. And everybody must face that, not least of all Nicola. I invite you to consider, those of you with any concept of history, how Ireland got itself out of the Union, how India and Pakistan got themselves out of the British Empire, how America got itself out of the British Empire, how Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, got itself out of the British Empire. I'm not, as people have read my blogs or heard my views on it, I'm not a fan of a unilateral declaration of independence. I know the significant risks to civil order, safety and everything else that would propose. But if you create a desperate people, if you create a desperate political entity and you deny them all legal routes, then you violate the most basic principle of trying to live with your neighbours, and that is never create a desperate man or woman. Now, we're sailing very close to that wind now. It's not one that I want to see, it's certainly not one the SNP wants to see, or any of the responsible contacts, friends, business contacts I have. Nobody wants to see that. But you're pushing Scotland into uncharted waters if we proceed towards this UK general election. It's not likely to happen till full term, but it could happen. Anything, another act of lunacy or idiocy by this Tory government could provoke it at any time. And there's a lot of wild men on both sides of this, and we don't want them loosed on it. There's also a lot of good people who do not really understand the issues, and they don't understand the big questions. Don't let's bury it in too much talk. Let's be very clear where we're at. We, Scotland, having successively elected governments who clear-cut backed independence, are being denied any legal route out of this union without the grace and favour permission of the government of the day in Westminster. That is unacceptable. It's fundamentally unacceptable to me. It should be fundamentally unacceptable to any self-respecting Scot. Think hard, Scots. You're coming to a pivotal time. And I don't want to become an abject, cringing Scot, which is where we're heading if we let this pass without proper and significant action. So sorry if that's been a bit disjointed. It's done without notes. It's done with a considerable emotional charge, which I'm trying to keep down in face of today's events, but it's also accompanied by some excitement and pleasure and the feeling that history is going to look back in this moment and say, depressing though it may initially have seemed, it was a pivotal moment that led to independence. So keep a close eye on all the television news programmes, the clips, listen to all the arguments, evaluate all the facts, and I have only one plea to all of you. Be a Scot and think what that means. Cheers. Good night.